and welcome to episode 9 of Ship, Sea and the Stars from Royal Museums Greenwich. Every week we're bringing you fabulous stories and history, the sea, space, creativity, lots of different things from the Royal Museums Greenwich curators and expert guests. If there's a question you've got or a topic you'd really like us to discuss, or you'd just like to get in touch and tell us what you think about all of this or anything else, please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. And the way to do that is to search for Royal Museums Greenwich on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram. So we are going to get to today's topic, and this is such a lovely topic. It is mermaids. And we know mermaids as, the exotic, mystical creatures that were perhaps the inhabitants of dramatic seas in childhood stories, or perhaps they were the weird creatures posing challenges to adults in fiction of various types. And they pop up again and again in myths and stories, and people have been fascinated by them throughout, for centuries. This is not a new thing. And so in this episode we're going to explore what mermaids are, merfolk, why they're so persistent, and not just what they have symbolized in the past, but what they symbolize to different communities today. And to help us dig into all of this, we have 3 fabulous guests. We've got an academic, an artist, and someone who's got both a personal and professional interest in mermaids. So let me introduce them to you. We have Sarah Peverley, who is a professor of English literature at the University of Liverpool. Sacha Coward, who's an expert in LGBT plus history and has also been a community participation producer at the National Maritime Museum. And Eve Shepherd, who is a sculptor who has made lots of very interesting works, but some of them are in the National Maritime Museum, and we will be talking about some of them today. So let's start with each of you just set yourself in the scene of mermaids. What's your relationship to mermaids? Sarah, let's start with you.
Well, I've been in love with mermaids since I was a child, and Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid broke my heart, like many people who love mermaids. As a grown-up, I'm interested in their history and how they help illuminate us as human beings, how they tell our story, how we're interconnected through political, cultural, religious uses of mermaids. So yeah, I love them all across the world, all across time.
Fabulous. Sacha, you can go next.
Yeah, so my introduction to mermaids was quite similar to Sarah, except mine was a VHS. So it was The Little Mermaid, the Disney film. And I watched it so much, that particularly the bit with Ursula in it, the sea witch, that it actually ran out the tape and it all went warped at that point. But then as I grew up and kind of came out and become part of the queer community and became a queer historian, then realizing that every time I went to Pride, I would see people dressed up as mermaids. I'd see giant mermaid banners. And I was like, what is the connection between gender and sexuality and this mythical creature I used to love as a kid? And then that's just fueled a total obsession. So I now describe myself as a mermaid hunter, which basically means any museum that I work with or go to, I'm always looking for mermaids because there's such a fascinating story to them.
Brilliant. I'm sure everyone else is going to be doing the same after this episode. And Eve, how about you?
I've always been interested in mermaids as well. I mean, a lot of my personal work is a kind of split human-animal to connect partly with mythology, but also to do with the human psyche, and sort of merging the two, the caricatures of the animal and then the human psyche side of things. So I'm really interested, but also as well, I've worked on a project with the National Maritime Museum where we worked with Mermaids UK, a group of trans and non-binary kids, to produce a mermaid-like character.
Brilliant. Well, we'll be hearing about that in a bit, but let's get started. Let's set the scene a little bit with one of the classic representations of a mermaid. It's an excerpt from an Oscar Wilde short story, The Fisherman and His Soul, and it's read by Simon Kane.
Every evening he went out upon the sea, and one evening the net was so heavy that hardly could he draw it into the boat. And he laughed and said to himself, "Surely I have caught all the fish that swim, or snared some dull monster that will be a marvel to men, or something of horror that the great queen will desire." And putting forth all his strength, he tugged at the coarse ropes till, like lines of blue enamel round a vase of bronze, the long veins rose up on his arms. He tugged at the thin ropes, and nearer came the circle of flat corks, and the net rose at last to the top of the water. But no fish at all was in it, nor any monster or thing of horror, but only a little mermaid lying fast asleep. Her hair was as a wet fleece of gold, and each separate hair as a thread of line gold in a cup of glass. Her body was as white ivory, and her tail was of silver and pearl. Silver and pearl was her tail, and the green weeds of the sea coiled round it. And like seashells were her ears, and her lips were like sea coral. The cold waves dashed over her cold breasts, and the salt glistened upon her eyelids. So beautiful was she that when the young fisherman saw her, he was filled with wonder, and he put out his hand and drew the net close to him, and leaning over the side he clasped her in his arms. And when he touched her, she gave a cry like a startled seagull, and woke, and looked at him in terror with mauve amethyst eyes, and struggled that she might escape. But he held her tightly to him, and would not suffer her to depart.
Now, there's so much in that. And the thing that strikes me about it is that bit at the start when he's imagining all the treasures of the sea that he could bring up. It could be big fish, it could be jewels, it could be all these weird things. And then this is what the sea gives him. And it's almost weirder than, stranger and more valuable than anything else he thought of. What about the rest of you? What do you really pick up in this? Sarah, it was your suggestion. What stands out for you in that reading?
There's just so much in it, isn't there? I think probably three striking things for me, that in-betweenness, you just mentioned that kind of strangeness, the alien nature of the sea and the things in it. It's not our natural habitat. And I love the way that he links the mermaid's description with the sea. She's got the coral lips and the shell-like ears. So she's at once humanoid, but she's different to us. And then, of course, that emphasis on the rarity, the treasure. She's got gold in her hair. She's linked with pearls and silver. And that connection with desire. He doesn't want to let her go. She's such a precious rarity. And throughout human history, we've had mermaids connected with the idea of desire. So, yeah, I think for me, those are the most striking things.
Eve, how about you?
Oscar Wilde, I think his writing is just so beautiful, and it's so rich with kind of visual content. I love the idea of like the bronze arms. He describes the sailor's arms, bronze arms with like the blue sort of veins standing out. But the thing that I found about this particular extract was this possession of her. There's something that we take from the sea and claim it as ours, like we have a total right to it. And I think that probably described maybe women at that time. And also as well, she sort of wails out just sort of once when she's startled, but the rest of the time it's describing her as this beautiful object, as opposed, she doesn't have a voice, almost Pygmalion-like. Mm-hmm. So, I think that it's quite telling of how women were viewed. Don't talk about the salt encrusted on her eyelids, like almost like makeup, natural makeup. She's just beautiful, and she's a young girl. So yeah, that's what it struck me. Yeah.
And Sacha, how about you?
Well, I'm also delighted that you picked a version of Mermaids written by Oscar Wilde, written by a gay or bisexual man, because that's kind of where my interest comes from. And the amazing thing about mermaids is they tell you about a lot of things. You can look at mermaids and learn about people's perspective on women, on race, on sexuality. And in that particular piece of writing, so Oscar Wilde, it's based on Hans Christian Andersen. It's almost like his rewrite, his version of that tale. And Hans Christian Andersen himself was a biromantic man. And then you go forward to the Disney adaptation that perhaps I'm most connected to from my childhood. And that was partially written by a gay man, Howard Ashman. So again, it's this fascinating thing for me. I always look at that symbol of this half fish, half human, beautiful but odd, monstrous but not frightening. And I can't help but realize why that's such a powerful symbol for people who feel a bit different. However that is, you want to be, you're different, that you're not part of this world, to quote Disney a little bit, but you want to be associated with something beautiful. And so a mermaid is a wonderful figurehead for anyone that feels a little bit different. And I feel like that description really rung true for me.
There's so much in this topic. I have to say, until this was proposed by the museum, not by me, I hadn't really thought about mermaids very much. And my whole view of them has changed already. Well, let's get stuck into what they really are and how long they've been around for. So Sarah, we're going to start with you, and you have an object for us which is an image of sirens from a bestiary, which are always excellent things. So tell us a little bit about the sirens and a little bit about the bestiary.
Okay, so bestiaries are medieval books of beasts, and they included real and what we would now define as imaginary creatures. They were all lumped together, and it was meant to be a book that gave you insights into the created world, into God's created world. These were Christian books. They were read across medieval Europe in the Christian tradition, and they were used to teach people about sin and salvation, but also about just the wonders of the world. And the reason that I picked this image, which is from around about the mid-13th century, is because it captures so many transformational moments in mermaid history. So there's a very, very long and ancient tradition of merfolk in early cultures. They date back hundreds of thousands, well, they date back tens of thousands of years. And by the time we get to the medieval image of the bestiary, the mermaids in that, we have this rich classical tradition that's come from ancient Greek culture, from Roman culture, from across the Mediterranean, the Middle East even. We have this real melting pot of what mermaids are. And medieval theologians would look at these creatures, not just mermaids, but things like unicorns, and they would try to read them allegorically. They would try and interpret them through their worldview. And so the sirens of ancient Greek and Roman mythology that were made so famous in Homer's Odyssey, they're dangerous creatures. They shipwreck men. That's their one duty in life, to beguile the sailors that pass and shipwreck them on the rocks. And for a medieval Christian reading this narrative, they would be taught that Odysseus's journey past the sirens was a really good metaphor, a really good allegory for life as a Christian, that you had to avoid shipwreck and spiritual shipwreck by avoiding all the sins and the temptations of the world that sirens, represented. By the time you get to this book, this bestiary, we have them beginning to be conflated with fish-tailed beings. They've already been conflated in iconography, but the literature about them starts mixing, particularly in England, ideas of sirens with what we would now call mermaids. So I think this captures that for me, but also it's more representative of how mermaids were used more generally by the Christian church in medieval Europe. And that was to teach people about sin and salvation. So the example that I've just given, sirens are a bad thing, but we also find mermaids being used in a really positive light. To teach about the dual nature of Christ. So that hybridity that's already been mentioned a couple of times in this discussion is really paramount to how the mermaid functions in medieval society. She can be a force for bad and wicked things, an emblem to avoid and to take Christian messages of salvation from, but she can also be a force for good, for teaching people about quite complex ideas. There's a wonderful 14th century Cornish play that was used to teach the community about Christ. And one of the ways in which it uses mermaids is by aligning them with Christ himself. So just as the mermaid is part fish and part woman, so Christ is part man and part God. So that kind of dual nature of them, the way in which they can be one thing or another, they sit in that in-between state, that liminal position where they're not one thing and they're not the other. They're a non-binary creature, if you like, to kind of use some of the language that I no doubt Sacha will pick up on later when.
Let's just come when we get to the definition of a mer, because there's also this concept of merfolk. Are these half and half creatures? Are they always? Is the human bit always female? Because it does seem that that's the dominant type, but then we do have representations where there are both.
Not always, no. The predominant form is the female form, and that's partly because most of these people writing these books that include mermaids and sirens, like the bestiary, and most of the artists drawing them are men, quite frankly. So there's that kind of objectification of the female form and the dangers of sexuality and that kind of thing from the woman. But you do get mermen in medieval art and literature. It's just they all tend to be lumped under the same banner. They're not really defined as mermen, they're defined still as mermaids. So mermaids was a kind of catch-all term for men and women in the past. It's only more recently that we have, I think probably from Victorian times, that we define a mermaid or a merman. In the past it was much more of a nebulous gender identity.
And you said that the sirens represent, you know, that the picture represents this transition, you know, the addition of the siren or the merging of those two ideas. Since then, since the 13th century, how have people have there been significant changes in the way people perceive mermaids, just briefly if you would, or has it been the same sort of concept over 700 years?
There are things that stay the same. So the idea of the danger of the siren has run throughout history, but there are adaptations and it gets recycled in really interesting ways. So mermaids can be used for pretty much, you pick a topic, I could probably give you an example of how a mermaid's been used like that. So there's a constant addition to mermaid mythology, and there's a constant harking back to the past. So I think this is one of the reasons it's so enduring as a symbol, that you can mold it, it's like water, you can put it into any kind of container and it will take that shape.
Well, let's move on to the shape it has, or some of the shapes that it has taken in modern society. You might think that, you know, in the modern world we've got iPhones and satellites and swanky technology, perhaps we don't need mermaids anymore, but they are still around. So Sacha, tell us what you have to show us next.
So I've picked a painting by the artist Evelyn de Morgan, and you can go and see this. Well, hopefully at some point you'll be able to go and see this at the Queen's House in Greenwich, and you can see it online. It is a gorgeous painting, and it has a whole host of mermaids, probably, you know, a really classic for our day and age. This is how, you know, if I Google mermaids, this is the image that I would expect to see, which is beautiful, sort of languishing, largely white. In this case, blonde hair, although Disney's had quite a bit impact on the way that we see mermaids since then. So in this painting, you have a whole grouping of mermaids. Now, this is depicting a scene from the original The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. And it's a scene where the sisters of Ariel come to the surface every day or every other day to look out at the human world. So this is them all kind of hanging out on the surface. Now, the reason I picked this is, one, because it's such a classical depiction of a mermaid. But if you look closely at their faces, they all have the same face.
It's quite disturbing, isn't it? When I first saw this painting, there's something very odd about the fact that they've all got the same face.
It is creepy. It is a little bit creepy, and I love Evelyn's work, but it's all got the same thing. One of the things I love, on one hand, they are all beautiful, but they all look very bored. So if you're stood looking at it as a viewer, rather than like seducing you, enticing you in, they look like they're you know, they're quite happy just hanging out with each other. And there's something about that I really love, which is the depiction of a woman painting mermaids, which makes it a little different. Now, the reason they have the same face is because they're all based on the same model, who was a woman called Jane Hale. So Evelyn had, basically Jane and Evelyn were incredibly close. They had a romantic relationship. Some of Evelyn's work of Jane has appeared in Tate Britain's Queer British Artists exhibition. So she had a husband, but she also had a relationship with Jane. And so she's put Jane again and again and again and again as mermaids, all kind of intertwined. And the way she's painted them is so different from how I think a male gaze would depict a woman's sexuality. Even though the painting's still sexual, there's a different vibe going there. So I thought it would be a really wonderful example to start exploring themes of queerness in mermaids.
So it's in the queer communities day, there are, as you said at the beginning, you know, in the Pride March, you will see lots of mermaids. Why do they pop up there? What's the connection that people feel?
Oh God, it's just like with Sarah. I know that we're all sitting here thinking we could make hours of this. Like the story is so long. So yeah, a mermaid, just like water, I love that analogy, fills up any space that you give. And one of those spaces is difference or queerness. And there's a classic example. So let's take the Starbucks logo. Classic mermaid with a split tail. Now, one of the original depictions of this kind of mermaid is of the Syrian goddess Atargatis. So we're going way, way, way back, way before Hans Christian Andersen. And this particular deity, she had a priestesshood of priestesses who would have been assigned male at birth and then would transition, would self-castrate and would live their lives as women devoted to this mermaid deity. Now, this is not just one occurrence. I'm not going to bore you to death by pulling them all out, but there are so many examples of mermaids, half one thing, half another, powerful but mysterious, monstrous and strange, being associated with people who have a differing gender, sexual orientation. And so today, if you go to Pride, you will see that it's a popular get-up for drag queens. It is rainbow hair. It is alongside unicorns and fairies. You will see glistening fish-tail tank tops. You will see giant camp mermaid banners. And this sort of symbolism you can find going back to Evelyn de Morgan. You can see it going back to Oscar Wilde. The examples are so many that this is not just, you know, the queer community. We don't own the mermaid any more than we own the rainbow, but we definitely have a connection to it, and that connection is fascinating, and that is a 6-hour podcast all of its own.
Well, just in the next minute here, then is part. So my view as an outsider is that there's this recognition the recognition is that they're an outsider. It's okay. It legitimizes difference, because if you can have something as powerful and iconic as a mermaid and that's different, then it's okay for you to be what society thinks of as different.
Exactly. If we're going to be occasionally described as monsters, can we please choose a monster that's beautiful and powerful and radiant? I can see why we'd want to associate with those monsters that aren't detestable, that aren't going to be, you know, pitchforks and shouted out the village. And one last thing is that, you know, if you look at a mermaid, so Ariel, we're talking about male and female appearing mermaids and mermen. Well, actually, they don't normally have any genitalia. So there is no gender in that sense. There's no biological sex. Ariel is a female. She's a woman because she uses she pronouns, and that's the way that she depicts herself. So for a lot of people, particularly those who are non-gender normative, trans people, non-binary people, looking at a mermaid who is, you know, whose genitalia has nothing to do with their gender is actually quite empowering. Again, it's not a monster. And it is male or it is female, it is whatever it says it is. And that has nothing to do with biological sex.
I'm sure Sarah will probably be able to tell us this, although hold on to it at the time being, Sarah, but I'd never really thought about this, but mermaids tend to be flat-chested. There are not very many busty mermaids. Now I think about it, I mean, I'm sure people have come up with some, but in the depiction, you know, you chose, they're all quite flat-chested. It isn't, as you say, it is androgynous. Right, there is so much, but we are going to move on, but to something related. We're going to move on to a project that Steve and Eve, look at this, I'm getting gender, everything's gender fluid already. So Eve, you had a project that you did, and it started with Sacha, but tell us, first of all, what the project is and what it symbolises.
The project... the project was amazing. It was such an amazing project for the National Maritime Museum, and it was basically to try and broaden out, I think, the museum's demographic, to connect to the people that actually came to the museum, and also to encourage people that maybe don't come to the museums because they don't feel represented in any shape or form. The majority of the collection that they had at that time was of busts of white male upper class, fellas. And so, it was a brainchild of, I'm not sure if it was a Sacha. I don't know if Sacha was the brainchild of, a little bit, okay. decided to select 3 community groups out of the community, one of which was Mermaids UK, which is a trans and non-binary group for kids and young people. So we did workshops with these kids to kind of, I wanted to try and see the community through their eyes rather than just sort of coming in from a different perspective and then going, there you go, that's what you're going to be. Which was amazing. So we did these, the kids were really generous, young people, and they explained lots of things what were important to them. And then I needed to go away and kind of process it and try and boil it down to the essence and produce a piece of work that was relevant to their entire community, and not just their community, but trans and non-binary people throughout time in general. It was a big ask and a brilliant project.
Let's have a look at the piece of art you produced, and as we're looking at, and it's a fabulous thing. Could you perhaps highlight some of the things that you represent, you know, that the community wanted you to represent, and point them out to us?
Well, just picking up on a point that I think Sacha made about the chest. The kids were really adamant that they wanted this piece of work to be bare-chested, which was apparently a really big deal for the community, because a lot of the kids would hide their chests because it's a depiction of their identity, potentially gender identity, you know, external gender identity, not their own. And so they wanted it to be bare-chested, but to have no features whatsoever, no nipples, no nothing. So it could be the gender was ambiguous. And that was a really, really key factor of this, which I think stands to reason, the ambiguity of the gender, so it could fit into any or all camps. And so, which was tricky, because we as a society are desperate to pin gender onto whatever. So the hair, for example, needed to be something that was, again, it was out of the ordinary. It needed, everything about this piece needed to be out of the ordinary in some ways, because I think that's how the group of kids kind of saw themselves. Not
DNA, is that DNA on there underneath the collarbones?
Yeah, so they were there. I think when I boiled what they were trying to say down to the sort of the bare essence, they were, I think, well, apart from the fact that tattoos were really important to them, it also as well, the idea of this this kind of creature kind of coming out of the sea, and it's ancient, it sort of goes way back to kind of primordial times, and I got a sense that they were sort of saying, we're not a fad, we're not a fashion, we are here and we've always been here. You know, when men and women were created, you know, back as amoebas, there was also a third, fourth and possibly fifth gender that came out as well, you know, and so we've always been here. So you've got this hence they wanted something about time and timelessness. And I went through various things like star charts and all sorts of other things, but the thing that seemed to fit with what they were trying to say was, it was this genetic thing, this DNA thing. And they also wanted as well to connect to nature. So they didn't see this creature as being solely about fish and human. They wanted it to be amphibious, but they were really specific with saying, sometimes it lives on land, sometimes it lives in the sea, sometimes it lives in the air. So yeah, so you can see on this particular picture, it's got scales on its back, and they also wanted an external vertebrae. So we've got this amalgamation of all sorts of different creatures that can inhabit all sorts of different environments, and that was really critical to them. So they could identify, it could fit into all different.
Could move between worlds.
Yeah, well, not that it could fit, it was part of the whole world and also the universe. They went beyond. It was like it was ancient, timeless. It was part plant even.
And what was their reaction when you, very briefly, what was their reaction when they saw, what was there a great unveiling? What happened at that moment? Were you there?
Yeah, I was there. Yes, so was Sacha. It was great. I mean, I think that they really connected to it. I mean, do you think so as well, Sacha?
I definitely did. It was one of the more moving experiences in my whole career. Was watching them see it was beautiful. Yeah, you did. You took their vision perfectly and expressed it.
Oh, bless, thank you. Well, I think it was so overdue. You know, because this community, you know, our community, the LGBT community, has been so silenced for so long, and you know, and just having something to identify them, you know, and us in a public space that isn't in a derogatory or negative way, you know, is really quite something.
Fabulous. Right. Well, we'll come back to some of these themes. For those of you, if you've just joined us, this is Ship, Sea and the Stars from Royal Museums Greenwich. And this week we're having a discussion about mermaids with Sarah Peverley, Sacha Coward and Eve Shepherd. So we're going to move on now to Sarah's next object. And this is the thing which, frankly, is one of the ugliest mermaids anyone has ever invented, I would think. Sarah, tell us what this is.
It's hideous. It's a horrible little beast of a thing, but it's important in the history of mermaids. And just to kind of pick up on the last point that Eve was making, it reminded me of a line that I've just been writing about mermaids as the connectors of worlds. They really do bridge all these different aspects of just world history, world communities, gender difference. Or you think of two opposites and a mermaid will unite them. And what this one does for me is unite the East and the West. So the hideous little creature that you've seen on the screen right now is more commonly known as a Fiji mermaid. There's a bit of a history to the name, which I'll explain. I'll come back to in a moment. But these creatures originated in Japan, and they were effigies made of spirits. One of the yokai in Japanese mythology, known as a ninyo. And the ninyo was a creature of the sea. It had a kind of monkey-like appearance on top rather than human torso, and a fish tail for its lower half. And when European sailors encountered these things, first of all, it was really the Dutch, because the Dutch were the only European community trading and having contact with Japan during its period of kind of isolation. And they would bring these things, they would see them and they would bring them back to the West, to various European countries, and people just went mad for them. And you can see why if you kind of put it in the context of what's happening at the time. And that was that there was a big debate in science about whether mermaids were real or not. There were more increased sightings of sea creatures that were thought to be mermaids as people began traveling more. And so at the time, the world was trying to work out, but particularly European scientists were trying to work out whether mermaids existed or not. So when something like this came along, it was a big thing, and it kind of married.
This was an actual object. It's not. Yes. We're not talking just about the picture here. There is an actual object that was shipped around the world, and people looked at it as this, you know, here it is, here's your mermaid.
Absolutely, and not just one of them. The one that image is from became the very famous Fiji mermaid. That's now lost to us. We think it got burnt down when one of the museums it was in burnt. But there are lots of them in private collections and local museums across Europe that are a bit smaller than the Fiji mermaid was said to be, but were coming across from the east. From places like Japan.
And what were they? Is this bits of animals sewn together? What were they actually made from?
Well, at the time, and until fairly recently, people thought that they literally had cut a monkey and a fish, a big fish like a carp or a salmon in half and joined them together. But recent studies of those that are in private collections and museums have suggested that they're made from papier-mâché, wire, clay. There is fish skin in there, and there are bits of simian jaws as well, so different bits of monkey jaws to give them the sharp teeth and the claws. And so this particular one from the advertisement that we've just seen was brought across to London in 1822 by a sailor, a Boston sea captain, who was running a trade route to London and Batavia. And he essentially sold a ship that he had an eighth share in. He only owned an eighth of it. He sold the ship and the cargo to buy this thing and bring it back to London, because he just thought it was going to make his fortune. He thought they were going to rewrite the natural history books, that this would change the world.
And was it a good investment? Did he get his money back?
It was not a good investment for him. But the man who ended up buying this 20 years later was P.T. Barnum, and he made an absolute fortune from it. And this is where it gets its name, the Fiji mermaid, from, because Barnum pitched it as a creature that had been discovered off the coast of Fiji. And he advertised it brilliantly, much better than Samuel Eads had done. What was Eads' downfall was that he'd sold the ship, and the person who owned the 7/8 of the ship that he didn't sued him. So he ended up having to go back to sea and work the rest of his life to pay off that debt.
Well, he was really committed to that. I mean, it's interesting here because there's something about people being so desperate that mermaids do exist that they will create them.
Yeah.
Because of that need. We're going to have to move on a little bit. I'm so sorry. But you know, we're going to move on. So just to talk a little bit about the things that mermaids can represent. You know, these are complex creatures, mystical, hard to understand. But we're going to come back to the what Eve was saying about underrepresented communities, and we're going to step away from mermaids a little bit. Eve, you have an encyclopedia to show us. Tell us about that.
I do. Here it is. So I used this particular encyclopedia quite a bit when I did the sea persons, or the persons of the sea bus, for the National Maritime, because I wanted to look at. So it's interesting, Sarah was saying about, you know, sort of the east and west perspective, and I wanted to look at things around religion a little bit, and understand why we in English, and in lots of Western languages, we only have things. You only have binary language, he, she. You know, there isn't a third, fourth, or whatever gender. And I think so. I wanted to look, because I know religion often shapes things like languages and lots of other things that embedded within our society. So when I made that piece, I started looking at queer myths and sort of more spiritual stuff to try and understand which faiths did include a much sort of broader perspective on, you know, all sorts of third and fourth genders. Things like the Native American Indians have, you know, they have anything from 3 to 5 genders, for example, and it's perfectly normal. It was perfectly within their faith.
So it sounds as though in a lot of the communities you read about in the encyclopedia, actually having just 2 is the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah, some of them. A lot of tribal beliefs, you know, they believed in a lot more. In fact, a lot of beliefs before things like Christianity and Judaism believed in much more of a sort of fluid. Christianity apparently once upon a time used to believe, or so I was told, that that God was both genders, and then somewhere along the line God became one gender and male. So, you know, religion, that particular religion, more patriarchal. So yes,
just a little bit to the idea of you know, communities that don't get a voice, and representations, and how important it is who gets represented and how it's represented. Because you have, let's just talk briefly about the other 2 sculptures, because along with the Person of the Sea that you showed us before, there were 2 others, and they also represented different communities. Tell us just a little bit about those.
Again, there were communities that hadn't had a voice in museums, particularly the National Maritime, but also pretty much every other museum. One was sort of immigrants and refugees, and the other one was, I guess, women and girls, really. And so yeah, so we did the same sort of format where we held workshops with these groups and I tried to understand what the kids wanted, how they identified themselves, you know, what their important things were, and then sort of pulled out those features. So, you know, this particular one, I've tried to keep it. It was genderless. The kids actually put a gender on this piece and said, you know, it's a girl, it's a woman, and then wrote a song about it. But I tried to keep it so that it was non-Caucasian, but it could be, you know, it's part African, it could be, you know, Mongolian, sort of eyes. So it was a split, because we're, again, so underrepresented, any sort of community who isn't Caucasian, that I needed to try and put it all in there, to represent refugees from across the world throughout time.
So there's all the, and oh, let's just hear very briefly about this. Is the girl guide? Then you can recognise the necktie.
Yeah.
Then this is an interesting question, actually. How women, I mean, girl guides is a very specific group to pick, actually. But what did they want, very briefly, represented in this sculpture?
They wanted pride. They wanted badges. There's a lot of history within this piece, and sadly, the girls from the girl guides, and as a society, we don't know what the girl guides did. And they did some amazing things. And again, a lot of the girls that were in the girl guides that did these amazing things did them, and I guess just came home from wherever they were and just carried on with life, and their history got lost. But a lot of the things within this, she's wearing this eye thing, which is, it's partly there because she needs to be incognito, partly because they were used as spies in the war, and partly because she's got to represent 10 million girls. So, you know, it was
responsibility there.
And there isn't, I couldn't find another sculpture of a girl guide. There's lots of scouts, but there aren't any girls.
Well, is it this idea of groups wanting to see themselves? Because in a way, you know, you can see categories as problematic because it's you're in this box or this box, but actually people need something to identify with. But then there's these really interesting ways that, and not always positive ways, that people respond when you break their mental boxes. People like their categories sometimes, and then if you put something in one category which they think should be in another, they don't respond very well. So we're going to come to Sacha now. Sacha, you have a painting to show us. Tell us about this.
So this is a painting which is part of the collection at the National Maritime Museum relating to the transatlantic slave trade, which is an amazing example of how we keep saying you can use mermaids as a lens to talk about anything. So in this sense, I want to briefly touch and talk about race and basically how museums have responded to colonization, and also thinking all the way up till today. So the connection that inspired this was conversations I've had over the new Disney film, of all things, which is going to be a live action reproduction of The Little Mermaid. And they have cast Ariel as a woman of color, as a black actress. And there was a public outcry from a lot of white fans saying that Ariel, who is depicted in a Disney film as being white and red-headed, well, mermaids have to be white. That is what they look like, that is what they are. Now, as someone who's been studying mermaids, and I'm sure Sarah feels the same, that you kind of roll your eyes because this is ridiculous on so many levels, on so many fundamental levels. But this example here is quite a dark example. A group of Jamaicans who'd been brought down to baptize. Now, they were being converted to Christianity. But the way that this was done, based on the notes that we have with this image, was by using the pre-existing religion, which was the Yoruba religion, a fantastic pantheonic religion, so very much like the Greek gods or the Romans, an entire pantheon of deities that we don't really talk about very much, but associated with West African culture. And they had a particular deity called Yamaya or Yamaja, and she was a water ocean goddess. Now, after meeting with Europeans, the form of her starts to take on this mermaid form. So people who practice Yoruba today will use a mermaid-like form, a black mermaid, to represent Yamaja. But here they use this idea of bathing in the water to honor Yamaya as being, well, why don't you just flip this and do it for Christianity? So they were using this worship of this oceanic deity that has, you know, an incredibly ancient history for African peoples, and using it to convert these people to Christianity. So again, you can use and look at, the mermaids tell you a lot about the people and the time that they were created. So the way that we talk about mermaids today, the films we watch, the conversations we have about mermaids, they tell us a lot about who we are today. And the way that mermaids were depicted 100, 200 years ago, you can learn a huge amount about gender and sexuality and race and all kinds of things by how they were depicted. So they're almost like a litmus test.
And have we seen other transitions in the past? So hopefully what will happen with this new film is that everyone will see a black Ariel and then go, oh, okay, mermaids can be black. It might not be that simple, but you know, you can hope. Are there examples in the past of, you know, someone coming along with a new image and then everyone going, oh, all right, they must look like that?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, if you look at the very concept of a mermaid, and Sarah was touching about this, has been formed from hybridizing concepts. So sirens mixed with our idea of mermaids, and now they've got the same kind of thing. So Ariel in Little Mermaid, she collects treasures. So she has who's it to what's it to plenty, as the song goes. Now that's based on a West African deity, which is Mamiwata, who collects objects, who loves treasures. There are many traits about her. So she's got a beautiful singing voice. This comes from sirens, from the Greeks. So everything that we have about mermaids, we may think they've always been this thing that we treasure, but they've always been changing. There is no single construct or image of a mermaid. So of course a mermaid can be black. Of course they can, because they have been in the past. Mermaids have been so many things to so many different people. And so they're a constantly changing image. And all we see today is a snapshot of what we're currently being presented.
I now want to see a sort of timeline of the world that you can walk along, you know, perhaps 200 meters long, and every meter there's what a mermaid looked like on that date. I'll have to, whoever it is who is in charge of exhibitions, maybe we can persuade them to do that at the museum. But as you, yeah, your thumbs up. Okay, I'll take your vote for that. Right, we have to move on. Just before we finish, I do have a very quick question for all of you, which is, as Sacha has just said, mermaids are always changing. What are the mermaids of the future going to look like? What do you want for them, or what do you think they're going to look like? Eve, you live very much in a conceptual world. You can go first.
I would like to see them being all inclusive. The mermaid UK thing, piece that I made, it was of all genders, and it was also of all races. So I would like to see that, something very kind.
Sarah, how about you?
I think I'd like to see them as emblems of our connection with the natural world again. They have been that in the past, and their very earliest roots are connected with that. And yeah, that kind of, spiritual is probably not the right word to use, because it should include people who don't necessarily have a religion. But that connection that we have as human beings with our natural environment, that kind of thing that transcends everyday concrete life, I'd like them to be that.
So an experiential connection. Okay, Sacha, how about you?
I want to see mermaids getting their fangs back a little bit. So we've been talking a little bit about mythology with scary mermaids that lure and maybe even eat sailors. Mermaids have got a little bit safe and a little bit soft and lovely, and you know, they've got one desire: they want to meet the perfect man and get married. Nothing wrong with that, but I would like to see mermaids with a bit of spunk, a bit of edge. I'd like to see some queer mermaids who are not happy with the status quo under the sea, and they're going to fight it. That's what I'd like to see.
A mermaid revolution, right? A queer mermaid revolution. We're in for that. Okay, fabulous. Thank you all so much. Next week, we are going to have an episode that comes a couple of days earlier on World Oceans Day, which is June the 8th. So instead of the usual Thursday episode, we will be streaming an ocean special on Monday the 8th of June. You can find out all about all of the things that are happening for World Oceans Day at rmg.co.uk/World Oceans Day. And after that, we'll take a couple of weeks break, just a short break. There'll be a couple of other events going on, but all 10 episodes that we've done of Ship, Sea and the Stars will be online at rmg.co.uk/museum from home, and we will be back with more soon, so you can do subscribe to us on Facebook and YouTube to make sure you don't miss out. And obviously you can get in contact, look for Royal Museums Greenwich on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. And do let us know what you think about the show, along with the short gap we're having. We're asking some questions, so if you've got opinions on it, if there's things you like or don't like, do send them along. We would really appreciate your comments, as honest as you like. And yes, so thank you for watching through us this first period. The museums are still sadly not open, but all the amazing ideas in them are still coming to you through all the online things that the museum is doing, so do have a look at all of that. We are going to finish on a story. We're going to play out actually on a short story, but before I tell you about that, I just have to say thank you to our 3 fabulous contributors: Sarah Peverley, Sacha Coward and Eve Shepherd. Thank you to Simon Kane for the reading, to Steve Thompson for our music. James Gill was the producer, and I'm Helen Charesky. And to play us out, we have a short story which has been adapted and read by Olivia Armstrong. It's very short. It's a retelling based on a folk tale by Oscar Wilde's, which is in a collection by Oscar Wilde's mother, actually, Lady Jane Wilde. And yes, so it's this retelling of a folk tale about a mermaid. So here you are with the description of the dead soldier.
It was an old belief in Ireland that sleeping upon the seashore was unlucky unless you were within the sound of church bells. Otherwise, a mermaid might lure you beneath the waves to your doom. 200 years ago or so, mermaids were called the spawn of the devil himself. To see the mermaid of the River Shannon in Athlone foretold a disaster or a crime being committed nearby. She only let herself be seen when bad luck was about. One summer's night, a fisherman on the Shannon felt his boat being pulled through a long, rippling streak of fresh blood. Suddenly, the little boat began to spin in circles, finally sinking beneath the waves, carrying him down, down, far below the water, fully conscious the whole while. He found himself in a land where flowers spilled like spun gold, the air itself a golden gauze and filled with a soft, alluring song. There sat the mermaid at the edge of a pool, singing to him, beguiling him, and offering him a goblet of dark red wine. He put it to his lips, but saw just in time it was not wine, but foaming red blood. He looked down to the mermaid's side and saw then the body of a drowned soldier, still in uniform, throat cut, and all around him a widening pool of blood. He made the sign of the cross, and immediately a wild storm arose. He remembered nothing more until he awoke on his boat once again in the Shannon, and he lay there until found by friends. A few days later, he heard a story of a soldier, a deserter being pursued from the Athlone barracks. He had taken his own life by cutting his throat and throwing himself into the Shannon. The fisherman realised that this was the corpse he had seen. It was said such suicides became the property of mermaids. The fisherman found no peace or rest until he made confession and was exorcised by a priest. That mermaid can still be seen in the twilight hours upon her rocks in the Shannon River, combing her hair, gazing into a silvery mirror, trying to lure victims to their death, and gloating over every misfortune that befalls humankind.